Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll let folks trickle in. I'm going to share my screen and talk about some of the upcoming webinars that we have at COEH. All right, so we've got a couple upcoming webinars on our website. On June 24th, later this month, Christina Banks with the California Labor Lab will present outcomes from the second of three phases of the Work Future Initiative, where researchers and practitioners from 18 different disciplines led discussions on the future of work and the worker experience. That's Wednesday, June 24th, 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific time. And then the other webinar that we have set up on the website is on September 16th on the hot topic of sensors and wearables with Jacqueline Hannon from the University of Michigan ERC. And in between, we'll also have more webinars coming down the pipe for July and August. And for more and to register for these webinars, you can visit us at cuh.berkeley.edu/webinars. I'll drop the link in the chat. There's that link as well. And now for today's webinar, I'd like to welcome everybody. Thank you for being here today and showing your support of the ERC webinar programs. As part of our industrial hygiene webinar series, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today's webinar on the evolution of the occupational hygiene profession via adoption of technologies in collaboration with the New York, New Jersey ERC. Just a few housekeeping items. You'll be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A box. That's going to be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. They recently did an update, and I believe that it's under the More button. We'll save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. And we'll also have the chat open. So feel free to use the chat, engage in the discussion, and participate. This presentation will be recorded, and that recording will be made available on the COEH YouTube page within the next 5 business days. Our presenter today has also made his slides available, so feel free to email us at coehce.berkeley.edu to get that slide deck. All participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive an email with a link to an evaluation form that will qualify participants for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once that evaluation is completed, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. Now, I am pleased to introduce our speaker today, Emanuele Cauda, PhD. Dr. Emanuele Cauda is a professional operating at the intersection of research and practice in occupational health and safety. His work focuses on exposure assessment methodologies, sensor technologies, systems, and decision-making frameworks, and the transformation of data into actionable knowledge that supports prevention. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Cauda. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much, Will, and welcome everyone for this webinar. And I want to thank the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health for the invitation to present my perspective and my thought about the evolution of occupational hygiene profession via the adoption of technologies. My name is Emanuele Cauda, and I'm going to spend a few seconds to talk about my background that can be relevant for this webinar. And in the meantime, I hope each of you can take out your smartphone and scan the QR code for a quick question. So I'm an engineer. I'm originally from Italy. I spent 20 years in the United States, and I worked at NIOSH for 19 years in different capacity, mostly in the area of monitoring methodologies and exposure monitoring methodologies, and then in the area of sensor technologies as well. I also started working with national and international organizations in the field of occupational hygiene, specifically the American Industrial Hygiene Association, and more recently at the international level with the International Occupational Hygiene Association and with ISO in the field of crystalline silica. I'm currently the convener for ISO in the area of crystalline silica, and I'm the chair of the committee of practice in Iowa for sensor technologies. I'm just saying this because I'm going to use several areas in my webinar today related to sensor technologies and aerosol specifically, even though I'm not going to be specifically talking about only aerosol hazards in the workplace. So to start this webinar about the profession, I thought it was important to start from the basis in terms of the definition of industrial and occupational hygiene, which is the art and science of anticipating, recognizing, evaluating, controlling, and confirming hazards and stressors in the workplace. I'm starting with the definition because I truly believe that the discipline of industrial and occupational hygiene is very strong, and we have an extremely strong base in knowledge and background. So we should always think about it in terms of evolution rather than revolution. So it's evolving for a number of reasons. When we start from this definition, many of you might be very familiar with a number of activities, procedures, frameworks in the field of risk assessment, risk management, hazard assessment, exposure assessment. This is what I consider the operationalization of a definition into activities that professionals, occupational hygienists, are conducting every day. At the same time, my topic is not going to be completely only technological and on the techniques and technologies, but also a little bit philosophical. And the first philosophical challenge that I have for you is why we're talking about art. I think some of you might have an idea why art. My personal opinion, the reason why we have the word art in the definition, comes from the discipline of Ramazzini and the foundation of occupational health. I think we need to think about an art because we feel for the workers, we empathize with them, we care deeply about the well-being of workers. So our commitment to protecting the health and safety, well-being, compel us to consider every possible perspective, every possible tool, every possible technology, and every possible sense in order to help workers being safe and healthy in the workplace as human beings. We can discuss even in the Q&A if you agree with this interpretation of the word art, but it's something that I'm truly committed to think about in that way, that we are not only technologists, but we are also people that we care for others. That's why we are in this profession. And when we think about sensing, when we think about technologies, the human being is a wonderful instrument and a wonderful system because we have a lot of senses. And through these senses, we can have a perception of the world around us and the workplace when we conduct our activities. But at the same time, there are many technological advancements. And thanks to the technological advancements, we can expand our sensory capabilities. We have the opportunity through many sensors, and I'm going to use the word sensor in a different way during this webinar, to ask more questions, to get more feedback, to understand better the workplace, to understand better the condition of the workers around us. So that's thanks to the technological advancements that are currently happening and been going on for decades, and they'll keep going. When we think about sensor technologies for occupational hygiene, these are already being used by occupational hygienists for many, many years. And that's in the field of gas and vapor, aerosols, noise, thermal stress, fatigue. Their adoption still, it is, in my opinion, in the opinion of many other people, is not systematic or operationalized. What exactly means operationalized means that these sensor technologies or the technologies in general are not part of the framework of activities that we are conducting day by day as professionals in occupational hygiene. So my webinar now is to try to show you some ideas and challenge in the use of these technologies by answering a number of questions. I started this topic, working on this topic while I was at NIOSH till few months ago, but I started in 2022 in a frame of the Center for Direct Reading and Sensor Technologies. When we published an article in a Synergist, the magazine of American Industrial Hygiene Associations, with other colleagues, and the article was called "The Challenge for Industrial Hygiene 4.0." And the idea was that occupational hygiene has a responsibility to evolve into OH 4.0. And that was true in 2022, and is still true in 2026, even maybe we need to talk about 5.0 now. And the fact that direct learning methodologies, real-time monitors, they need to be considered complementary rather than alternative tools to traditional approaches. But most importantly, that the interaction between technologies, workers, workplace, and professionals will represent an opportunity to do better our job, but also challenges. And so, as I said, I'm going to present you a number of questions today, and I'm going to present some ideas about each of the questions about this idea of evolution of the profession while adopting these technologies. The first question is about the concept of time and whether sensor technologies are redefining our idea of time. This is a statement that I heard almost 20 years ago by a former NIOSH director. And he said that the health and safety of workers should be the urgency for our effort. We are rushing what we're doing because we want to protect workers as soon as possible. So we have a very clear indication of time. If possible, we would like to protect them even before something is happening to them, or as soon as we know. I'm going to show you a case that I'm very familiar with in coal mines in the US. Traditionally, to monitor the exposure of coal miners to coal dust, we used to have the traditional method of collecting of a sample, sending the sample to the lab, and then we were getting one data point from the lab after 15 days. And then one data point was the time weighted average of exposure of personal exposure for the worker. Through a sensor technologies, now we can have a monitor from Thermo Scientific that allows us to monitor, again, in a moving average every 15 minutes data point. And believe me, there are people that are thinking that one data point every 15 minutes, it is not exactly very timely. We should do it even better than that. In my opinion, 15 minutes data point is much better than 15 days data point. But this brings a good question about the concept of real-time monitoring and the concept of time. Real-time monitoring is something that is you probably heard many times, if not many times a day, and is a concept that is widely used, but it can also be confusing because there are at least two ideas associated with the idea of real-time. The first idea is the possibility to assess a condition immediately compared to the collection of a sample and post-analysis. It is the idea of a timely assessment, because if we can timely assess a condition, then we can lead to an action and reaction. As soon as it happens, we're going to do something. The second idea, still for real-time monitoring, is the possibility to assess a condition in time compared to a snapshot. It's the same difference between a photograph and a video. The video is a quick sequence of frames, right? But the idea of in time, it is different from the idea of immediately and timely. Even though in sensor technologies, these two ideas might coexist in the same instrument, in the same gadget. So, for example, in confined space monitoring, the focus is much more on the timely information rather than collecting time series data. If we're sending workers in a confined space, we want a monitor that is going to detect and alert someone right away for action. We don't care, or at least we have not used data in time. But if we're doing task analysis, exposure evaluation, we might collect data for days, we might collect data for weeks and months without notifying no one. And that's because sometimes industrial hygienists might not want workers to take immediate action, because maybe workers are not in the best position to take an action, because an action needs to be planned after the evaluation of the data, the proper understanding what's the best priority, what to do. So you can see how, from a real-time perspective, they are totally different fields. So sensor technologies can definitely detect occupational hazard and stressor when needed, so the idea of timely, and they can record the presence and intensity of a stressor in time if needed at the needed frequency. Maybe one data point every half an hour might be totally enough if we are monitoring for months. And the sensor technology can also allow the right people to be notified at the right time. So my challenge is actually, I wonder if we should talk about right time technologies rather than real time technologies. All right, so moving on to the second challenge or provocation is the fact that is area monitoring really inferior to personal monitoring? When we think about personal exposure monitoring, we really think that it's the best to monitor the exposure of a worker. Instead, if we're doing area monitoring, we are not really detecting the personal exposure, which is true. At the same time, this was something that was brought up by Cass Baderhorst from South Africa at the Iowa conference a couple of years ago. Occupational hygiene invests most of the time on the receptors. We really care about the exposure of the workers, but we don't spend enough time on the sources and pathways, meaning the hazard. But technically, the goal of occupational hygiene is to maintain a workplace that is safe and healthy for the workers. So if we want to maintain a workplace that is safe and healthy, why are we not managing the workplace? Why are we not monitoring the workplace in order to manage the workplace? If we need to control the workplace, we need to monitor the workplace. So we need to focus on the source and pathway. So let's take the case of a sand mine, and let's take the case of a bagging warehouse. That's a couple of pictures about a warehouse that I spent many weeks in the past years. So it's an area where workers are moving with forklift, they're walking around, and they're filling up these huge bags with sand that is going to be then shipped to clients. Well, with the use of area monitoring that we can consider hazard monitoring deployed around the workplace, we were able to collect a lot of data in time through the different location to have a better understanding of the temporal and spatial variability of the hazard in time. Focusing down to 1 week of data for one of the node, that's what you get from that type of technology. But that type of the chart and graph is going to bring new questions. And the most difficult one to answer by an occupational hygienist, and that I heard many times asking to me, is, so looking at that, are the levels okay? Are the workers protected? And the answer is not that straightforward, but answering that questions allows you to operationalize that type of hazard sensing and hazard monitoring. So how do you answer those questions? Well, you need to ask, what is the trigger level if the trigger level is selected by an occupational exposure limit? How many hours a worker, multiple workers spend in that microenvironment? What are the actions when levels go above a possible trigger level? Do we know what needs to happen? Do we have a plan? So in that case, for example, a safe level can be a level in which the level is in time, if hour by hour is below a certain number. Then we can have a caution level, and then we can have an alarm level. But then we still need to know what is happening. So when we do control technologies, we intrinsically ask these questions and we give answers. But the sensor technologies and technology in general can allow us to answer those questions in a systematic way. Then when all this is done, then you can do periodic exposure monitoring at a personal level that can confirm the protection of workers. And so from that chart that I showed you a couple of slides before, you can get to this chart based on the trigger and the different level of safe, caution, alarm. And you can have an understanding which days are worse, and then trying to answer the question, what is happening? What was the process doing? Can we do something to fix it? That's not only for crystalline silica, but for example, it can be done for noise, which is much more a common way of doing mapping in the case of noise monitoring. So hazard monitoring can be relabeled process monitoring and eventually process health and safety risk management if the occupational hygiene information are combined with engineering and process design. So we are using the data from hazard monitoring to give it to the engineers to say, okay, we need to do something. In those days, something is going wrong. And we have the data to talk about that. So we have the evidence and the information and knowledge. Successfully managing the risk using hazard monitoring can protect the workers without overly relying on personal exposure monitoring, can confirm in time that your strategy, the one that you design as an hygienist, together with the other people around you, are indeed effective. They can provide alert in case of abnormal conditions. And ultimately, they can provide occupational hygiene performance metric values, also from an economic perspective, to your supervisor, to the corporate, to the people that are financing for these changes in the workplace. Can hazard monitoring replace personal exposure monitoring? And obviously, the answer is no. I'm actually quite skeptical that using hazard monitoring in some way can be used for personal exposure monitoring, even by knowing the location of the workers. If we're doing all that, let's do personal exposure monitoring, would be much better. But at the same time, can provide you more information for other complementary needs and activities you're doing. And finally, is do the consideration change based on the hazard? Obviously, if you're talking about CO level, the type of alarm, alert, and save could be totally different. And the reaction time might not be days, might need to be minutes or seconds. But the evolution of occupational hygiene forced professionals to address these new questions about the tools that you have around you. If you're interested about this topic, especially in terms of detection systems, AHA has published a white paper on this topic, and also another document on industrial hygiene performance metrics, where the performance metrics, through the technologies and adoption of technologies, can generate data to understand if your program is indeed going in the right direction. Moving on to another question and provocation, it is, does one monitoring tool fit every need? Few years ago, when I started in this field of sensor technology especially, we designed a campaign and slogan that was called Right Censored, Use It Right. And the deal was that the component development, selection, adoption, and data interpretation of sensor technologies requires a new framework, a new way of thinking. When we think about right sensor, it doesn't mean the idea of picking up the right gadget at the expo of a conference or going to the supermarket. It's understanding what exactly are you trying to achieve, what is your task, what is the objective, and then what is the hypothesis, and that will lead to the selection of the technology. When we think about use it right, it's not the idea only of reading a manual of a device, which I really hope each of you is doing when you're using a new technology. But it's to understand the capabilities and limitation of each technology and the data from those technologies. Any technology has limitations, even the most traditional one and most established, even the standardized one. There are limitations, there are uncertainty. So we need to understand those strengths and limitations when we do implementation and adoption of a certain technologies and methodology. At the same time, I go back to the definition of occupational hygiene and the different activities of anticipation, recognition, evaluation, control, and confirmation. Each of these categories, each of these activities have underneath basically a number of questions. In the case of anticipation is, can we use pre-existing information to anticipate the presence of another stressors? Recognition can preliminary data estimate the intensity and frequency of exposure to another stressors, and on for evaluation, control, and confirmation. I just want to spend a few seconds. I'm going to leave the questions in front of you for a couple of seconds, just to show how different are these questions. They basically follow a different part of the pathway from the awareness of the presence of an hazard to the point that we have a control in place and we want just to confirm the control is effective or not. At the same time, especially for the majority of hazards, hygienists use generally one single tool for each of these questions. We are still using only one tool. And that's strange because the questions are so different from each other that it's strange that one tool can fit all the needs. So take the case of a quarry, take the case of engineering stone that is common for many places at the moment is a very important topic of discussion in the United States, in Australia, in South Africa, in Europe. So engineering stone and exposure of workers to engineering stone material particles. When we think about anticipations, my opinion is we don't need sensors. In reality, your sensor, it's you, your eyes, your perception of what's going on, your understanding, your prior experience in similar environments in terms of task, in terms of activities, or maybe using database. In the case of silica, OCal in Canada has an amazing silica control tool that was previously designed in British Columbia by a group there in Vancouver. So we don't need sensors. We don't need to collect data when we are in the anticipation mode, in anticipation phase. Instead, when we are in recognition, then it might be the moment when maybe you need to start using some sensors. It doesn't matter, they're not accurate completely. It just provides you information in terms of temporal, spatial variabilities, at the same time, even using worker support, your eyes, and a pen can be a perfect tool, for example, to create a database for the condition of enclosed cabs based on several variabilities. I've been working with some hygienists around the world, and they are working on site where they have 20, 30 enclosed cabs, and they're all different. So why not to have a database in which you are basically noting down the condition of each of them? What is the condition? What is the culture of the worker? What is the propensity of the worker to keep the cab clean? That can give you some information about where to do the full evaluation phase, how to do it, where to focus, what are the priorities. Then we move into the evaluation phase, which is what I call all hands on deck. That's the most intense area. Is the most intense area, meaning you can use all the possible tools and technologies from an exposure perspective, from an hazard evaluation perspective. Sensor, in this case, they can be truly complementary. You need to spend as much as time as needed because the goal is to characterize the hazard and exposure, to create a SAG, identification of priorities from a control perspective. You need to have a quantity is where you're focusing on. You need to know quality and variety. This is going to be a moment in time in the future where the best people are going to be the ones that are going to use advanced data analysis tools to combine together data set of different type to give you the best set of information so that you can go to your corporate people to ask for money to do control technologies or to justify some actions or to talk with workers to convince them to do something else. Then we're going to move into control and confirmation. Once the control is in place, because you identify the control, you add engineers installing the control, there needs to be a cruise control mode. What does it mean? You don't want to be involved. You want to be involved as little as possible in the confirmation phase because you are focusing on another hazard. You cannot focus on one hazard only all the time. You have multiple activities and multiple things that you need to work on. So technologies here can help you because might continuously provide you that verification, might generate dashboard. Workers might know that that day was okay, or that we automatically adjusting ventilation, we are automatically adjusting scrubbers, or we are automatically adjusting other mitigation strategies thanks to the technologies. So the technology are going to start talking together to keep the condition at the level that we want. And that's back to the idea that you need to be the one defining the condition that you want for your workplace, and then periodically doing personal exposure monitoring for any hazard whatsoever. And we're going to go to the point where basically the confirmation and the anticipation are going to be basically the same cycle. We're going to go back to anticipation evaluation without even noticing, basically. I show you this in terms of crystalline silica or aerosol again, but in reality, this happened to other hazards. I was fortunate enough to work with some amazing professionals in the field of fatigue monitoring, and I learned so much in terms of fatigue without calling myself an expert now. But there are so many technologies when we talk about fatigue in terms of assessment and mitigation strategies. And each of these methodologies and each of these technologies are all different. The level of accuracy, it's from very low level because it's very a rough estimate when we use biomodels to something that is extremely accurate. The ease of use, so how intensive and how invasive is for the workers, obviously is on the other side, means it becomes very invasive. So the selection of the tool at the right moment in terms of doing an assessment or to do a mitigation strategy is critical. We cannot use them all at the same time. Or at least if we do, we need to combine them properly by identification of the objective of what we are trying to achieve. All right, so I'm going to move to the last question that I have, and is the most ethically interesting, and is whether technologies can help hygienists work better within the workplace system. So I'm truly convinced, after so many years of engaging and interacting with hygienists, I'm truly convinced that there is not one single hygienist type. Um, we have the do-yourself hygienist that is always dirty, fixing things, whether are technologies for monitoring or in the workplace. You have the academic type. You have the business, the one that is really into the economics things and talk with corporate, trying to optimize the program at your website. Then you have the methodical hygienist, the one that knows everything about all the methods, all the procedures, all the best practices. And then you have the workers hygienist. I'm sure that many of you knows of worker hygienists. These are the people that have amazing way of interacting with people in the field. All the workers are going to them to share stories and point them to possible issues and possible solutions. So each type needs to leverage tools, sensors, other technologies to their advantage. These technologies can be used to convince or present progress to corporate to obtain more funding, can be used to convince workers on, look, you need to use that PPE. Let's say, for example, for welding. I've experienced now people that are doing welding and they don't like to wear paper. And the use of sensor can say, look, you're in a field, there's no way to use a LEV or downdraft table. You need to use the paper. That's why I'm going to show you the difference with and without. Um, these sensor technologies in general, through machines and process, there can be the proper way of communication with mechanics in order to adjust a scrubber system, in order to adjust a system within the workplace. And that's because hygienists do not work alone. Hygienists in the workplace are interacting with process engineers, they're interacting with other safety professionals, with ergonomists, with physicians, maybe less, but in the future might be more, with psychologists. And more importantly, clearly, they are interacting with workers. Now, if we want to go one step further, the link between all these people and groups of people, including society, family, unions, co-workers, can become quite complicated. And actually, it's an area of interest for me at the moment, how technologies in technology and the profession itself can help the communication between the different groups of people and professionals. So let's talk about the complicated occupational hazard. And when I talk about how technologies can be used to have complicated conversations, let's talk about heat stress, because it's something that many of you might be familiar with, you're working on. And the fact that heat stress is common to many workplace environment, both outdoors, like construction, agriculture, road work, or indoor, like gas plant, foundries, paper mills. Um, so, occupational hygienist in the field of heat stress is my experience. They really like to engage and to interact, or at least they should interact with safety professionals. They're interacting with proactive employers, with the unions, and even with politicians. They are setting up rules on concept like environmental condition, whether it's heat stress, so heat index or WBGT, or we're talking about clothing, which is a factor when we're talking about heat stress and workload. Down at the bottom, I indicated, I just decided to copy and paste the ACGH, TLV for heat stress that I found a very elegant approach from an exposure limit when we're talking about an hazard. Interesting enough, most heat stress regulations are prescriptive based. What does it mean? There are a set of rules and recipes that you should focus, and once the level is above a certain degree, then you need to do this, this, and that. And there, basically, you follow the recipe, which is a very common approach for safety professionals, for example. So that's the way how even technologies like smart apps from NIOSH, OSHA in the United States, or AIJ more recently, or the use of sensors like the WBGT monitors can be very helpful to follow this type of paradigm of a prescriptive based rule. At the same time, hygienists are also interacting, or they should, with occupational physicians in the field of heat stress. And the reason is because the response of each worker to heat stress, it is well known to be substantially different. There are many factors, worker by worker, that can have an effect on heat strain. Body mass index, age, pre-existing condition, use of medication and drugs, even sex, all these can have an effect on heat strain. So why hygienists are talking with physicians? Because physicians, they care about the health status of the worker. And so the use of physiological monitoring or physiological methodologies in terms of understanding the endpoints of exposure to heat stress in terms of actual condition day by day or minute by minute can be of interest for this type of interaction. There are at the moment on the market several sensors, wearables, the way we call them, to detect heat strain. They're all different. They all measure something slightly different. Some of them, they measure core body temperature in an indirect way, or sweat characteristics, or saliva characteristics. But each of them can be a metric in a way for professionals to discuss and to have a conversation about this topic. When we talk about wearables, I had to put a slide about something that I was working together with other researchers at NIOSH, including the NIOSH director, Dr. Howard, because this possible increased use of wearables that I know that's been presented by other webinars on this topic is of interest, but it needs to be done carefully because we might lead to the point of every worker to have a monitor all the time. And the idea of wearable means wear and forget. You have it, you use it, you don't even think about it. And we might go from a health and safety professional mindset into a workforce science. The workers might know, and then maybe they might act if they know what to do and they're allowed to do it from an ethical perspective and from a perspective of the workplace culture. Finally, though, the question needs to be what is the cost for the workers in terms of having a burden on themselves if we're going from portable, attachable, even who knows in the future to implantable devices. So why I said that heat stress is the perfect case when we talk about complicated discussion in occupational hazard and the possibility of using technologies for this communication. Because when we talk about heat stress monitoring, that type of understanding about the environment, the workplace, the workload, the PPE can provide a successful heat stress management plan where safety professional, hygienists, employers, union workers can agree, okay, we understand what we want to do and we know what is the risk and we're managing the risk in that environment. But on the other side, physiological monitoring, like wearables, can provide a framework for timely addressing the effect of for each worker. So then we have a conversation worker by worker about their condition based on the data that we're getting, and maybe with the involvement of healthcare professionals and physicians. Now, at the same time, there can be uncomfortable conversation based on this, and there can be even more critical ethical questions whether we are creating the super workers or should be the workplace at the point that should accept everyone to work in that environment. Clearly, when we talk about technologies, there's always the question about the ethical consideration and the possible repercussions for the workers. I thought to bring to your attention a couple of large publications by the International Labour Organization that last year published a monograph on the revolution of health and safety in the case of AI and digitalization. I didn't want to spend any time on AI today, but it's something that in general technology should always be at the service of the workers for their health and safety. If it's what we're working is health and safety, it should not create additional harm for the workers. So I have few final remarks that I think will allow me to have around 15 minutes at least of possible discussion with all of you. And I really hope to get some question and some topic of discussion from my provocations. So I'm convinced that there needs to be an evolution in the occupational hygiene discipline by embracing technologies, including sensor technologies. But to do so, we need to keep discussing and revising terminology, as did today, in terms of what it means real time. So we should not be scared in challenging terminology, language, because if the world is evolving, the language should evolve as well. We should leverage technologies of any type for what they can deliver, such as, for example, the possibility of monitoring continuously the workplace without relying on personal exposure monitoring only, but because we are trying to control and mitigate and keep the workplace safe and healthy for the people. The idea of the toolbox is something that I'm strongly attached to, and is the fact that in occupational hygiene is so much more the checking for compliance with an occupational exposure limit. If the only goal for the profession is to check compliance with an exposure limit, we're going to need one tool only, and that's it. But then it's going to be our fault not to extend the use of the tools because the profession is much more than checking for compliance. And finally, we need to remember that the occupational hygiene practice needs to stay worker-centered, even if we embrace sensor technologies and other type of technologies and digitalization. Our focus needs to be on the workers to stay in the workplace, but to keep them safe and healthy in the workplace. And with this, I'm gonna stop here, but I'm gonna advance my slide because I'm gonna see if any of you has answered my question about the challenge about the name of the discipline. But I'm gonna just say one more thing, which is still the occupational hygienist is still the smartest sensor because we're gonna be the one making a decision on this. So let me check on this. And I think, oh, I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to answer. I hope some of you did it. I see that at least it's 100% on occupational hygiene rather than industrial hygiene. So I'm going to probably rely this to the American Industrial Hygiene Association. And it's going up 75-25, 80-20. So I'm going to leave it up and open for questions in consideration if any of you has it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emanuele. That was a great presentation and such a holistic view of the field. And I loved how you were presenting things as provocations, making us think about our assumptions about occupational hygiene. I wanted to start with a question that I was thinking about. Have you thought about, early career occupational hygienists and folks who, are starting to gather these assumptions around the field? How do you think about education and perhaps switching how we teach people in PhD programs or even, undergraduate?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So I have a faculty position at the University of Pittsburgh in public health as an adjunct professor, and I teach to master students and PhD students on occupational hygiene. So I think it's definitely an interesting moment in time. I truly believe that the basic of occupational hygiene discipline are so important that everybody should know them. So we should always start there. But at the same time, there are so many other aspects of the discipline and profession that are becoming so much more important that we cannot stop on the basic. And the last couple of things is one, for any young student is to go in the field, spend time in the field. Hopefully, your program allows you to have experience in terms of tours, in terms of internships, in terms of opportunities. Um, it- Occupational hygiene is such intertwined with field environments, with occupational environment, workplaces, and it cannot be studied or they can only be work in the office, sorry, in a classroom or in the lab. It needs to be
Mm.
done in the field. And the last part is branch out to other disciplines, which can be data analysts, can be lawyers, can be economists, can be people doing data storytelling. Um, if we are gonna just saying, well, we are the best at everything, then you're not gonna be the best at anything, unfortunately. So there's a need to collaborate. There's a need of synergic work because then also that is gonna happen in the field as well. As I showed, in the workplace, an hygienist needs to interact with workers, to interact with employers, mechanics, or engineers, with safety professionals, physicians, and unfortunately, many times, none of them are hygienists. So when there are many professionals, they don't speak with an hygienist unless they go to conference. And so unless you learn how to speak a different language in multiple languages, meaning of multiple people, then you're gonna have a very hard time.
Thank you. That, it makes you think about the balance of the jack of all trades and the master of none, and this balance between generalization and specialization. Um,
Um,
Thank you for that answer. We have a question about standards and this idea that TLVs and standards were often generated using traditional sampling methods. That's where we get most of our standards. What do
yeah.
you think is the best method or process to adapting new sampling technologies to the decision frameworks of existing TLVs? Is the option to adapt TLVs to new sampling capabilities? How do you think about that interplay?
Yeah, so I mean, the TLVs, occupational exposure limit, are a framework of understanding of basically using that number, magic number for hazard in different places to say, look, if you can keep workers under that level, everybody is okay. You can go home to have your dinner, right? But then in reality, those exposure limits are actually changing in time. So that actually means that those type of framework are evolving as well. So my suggestion, encouragement even to young people is always to work within the framework that is needed in that environment. And the framework means there's an exposure limit and you need to do it in a certain way. That's the way you need to do it as well. But that doesn't mean that is the only way that you do it. And so the opportunity is always the need is always to keep the eye on the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to keep workers protected from hazard and stressors that can lead to injuries or health effects, right? So we all know that keeping a worker under an exposure limit, for example, collecting free samples a year, if you're very lucky, that doesn't actually mean that you are protecting the worker. And I didn't want to include that slides in terms of Bayesian statistics, but you should use Bayesian statistics to understand where you're standing, collecting few samples a year or few samples a decade. So what I'm trying to say is back to the same idea of having multiple perspective. Play the game in terms of exposure limit and compliance and um, from a exposure framework perspective or regulatory framework on one side, but on the other side is for some type of hazards, talking about carcinogenic, for example, you know that the level should be as low as possible. So the goal should be always protecting the workers in the best way possible. And I do believe that technologies can help you from that perspective as well. So I'm not convinced, for example, that sensor technology needs to be absolutely accurate to assess the level in terms of exposure limit. To
Mm,
do so, use the traditional method. I use it all the time. But the traditional methods have huge limitations. And so let's fill up the gap of the limitation with other tools from the toolbox. I will never use a screwdriver as an hammer. So don't do as well with the tools in occupational hygiene.
Thank you. There's a similar question, or rather related. As far as selection of wearables, do you know of any guidelines around how to select a wearable for the workplace that is reliable and accurate? You know, there are so many new technologies coming out and new sensors on the market.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
I think guidelines or some white papers or some indication that might come, and I'm thinking in both from a US perspective, American Industrial Hygiene Association, but I'm also thinking from an international perspective, IOA. So there are a lot of working groups that are focusing on that. At the same time, I'm also realistic, and technologies and what is on the market is changing so rapidly and constantly that I'm strongly of the opinion that each of each of us has a responsibility to be very pedantic and ask questions. And when you're done asking questions to the vendor, keep asking more questions and then more
Mm,
questions until you are very sure that you know what you're getting. And once you start using a technology, be skeptical and go very slowly into any implementation. And I'm not only talking about accuracy, I'm also talking about in terms of the possibility of pushback from the workers. I'm the first one that probably wouldn't like to have a video camera that is following everything that I'm doing during my day in my profession. Why should a worker be happy? But a worker might be happy to have a camera if that type of interaction has been done gradually. And there's a
mm,
possibility that the hygienist is doing himself or themselves, and then maybe explaining the possible benefit. So I know that that's not a straight answer, but I think we are going in that direction, that associations and organizations are helping that. And I encourage everyone to get involved, but it's going to come as a community effort to fill the distance between the inventors and the users and the people doing
mhm.
standards as well.
That makes a lot of sense that there's no easy answer, especially at this junction in time. I have another question from the audience. Have you considered the applications of emergency responders entering unknown and potentially quickly changing atmospheres?
Um, Not specific in that perspective, but that's a very it's a very important aspect. I mean, I'm thinking immediately even like firefighters, for example,
Hmm.
right? Um, and that's lead to another set of questions, even in terms of like hierarchy of control for firefighters, where the elimination cannot be really that we take off the fire, because actually the
Hmm.
fire is the reason why the firefighters are there. But if you think about firefighters and the use of wearables, maybe not from a chemical exposure, but heat stress as well, that's exactly the situation where physiological monitors that can indicate that out of a crew of 10, there's a guy that maybe that day is not feeling great and his level of heart rate is going up to the roof. I don't think why a wearable cannot be better than the body system. I mean, the body system, the idea that somebody else is checking on me and I'm checking on them is awesome, but as biased as a wearable. So if a wearable
Mm,
can help in that process, I don't see why not. So I think that can be a great situation, almost in terms of safety in a way, than hygiene level.
mm. Um, that makes me refer to a question that we've had. What is the difference between industrial hygiene and the general term of safety?
Can I pass the question to the audience? I
Sure,
asked the
yeah, we can
same
have
very question. Yeah, because I asked the same very question generally as the first time that I talk with somebody that is telling me that is an hygienist, not a safety professional. And say, so what exactly is the difference between an hygienist and a safety professional? I have my opinion. I do believe hygienists are much more into the Ramazzini feeling of art and science.
mm,
Instead, the safety are coming so much more from a process perspective and maybe more on the engineering side. But I'm also
hmm
very convinced that I have many friends that are safety professionals. They are thinking as an hygienist much more than a safety professional traditional way, and the other way is true. So I think it's the only there are fields that are evolving in time as well, and it's okay. We should not be too much focused on creating categories and silos, in my opinion.
Mm, that's a great point. Another question, and we talked about this a little bit in, educating new folks in the field. Do you have any comments on multi-generational interactions in the workplace and how generations might affect this work?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, my main experience in the workplace is generally mining, oil and gas, construction and foundry at the moment. So uh, you care for them. You care for the workers, whether they are newbies and they just started, or they have been there in the field for 40 years. My personal experience, and for example, for me, when I started working in this field in the US, coming from Italy, everybody pick up, strange enough, everybody pick up my accent. But it was, so I was somebody from outside, but gradually, if they know you care for them, I think that caring really destroy the barriers even from a generational perspective. Care and
Mm,
respect. I mean, people are there to work. They are there because they have a salary. They are bringing money home. Um, I think everybody, workers, but also employers, in great majority, they care for people. There are exceptions, but the point is trying to bring them to the point that they can not only care, but also for themselves, of employer, for the workers, but they can be put in a position to act so that they can keep people safe and healthy. Um, I always say to my students that occupational hygienists serve the workers even though they are paid by the employer. It's we don't serve the employers. We are an independent entity within the organization. It's true that sometimes you are under HR, sometimes under process, but as a discipline, we serve the workers. And then we need to have a salary as well. So generally we are paid by the employer.
mm. That's a great perspective, and I think goes along with this general theme of finding connection and emphasizing care versus kind of like seeing difference and seeing how we're siloed in different ways. Um,
Absolutely.
Another question in that theme, occupational hygiene or industrial hygiene and ergonomics tend to have very different skill sets in training, um, but their definitions seem more similar, and in some way they're doing very similar work. Is OH really different from ergonomics outside of how we've operationally trained people under those titles?
Yeah. That's another very good question. So I'm happy about this because probably some of my provocations were absorbed or they resonate with people.
Mm,
I'm not an ergonomist, but I work with a lot of ergonomists. And for many years, I was told that ergonomics is all about musculoskeletal disorder. And luckily, now in time, I realize that's not only the topic. I mean, a lot of ergonomists they work on musculoskeletal disorder. But ergonomy is actually the idea of interaction between process and systems and workplace and environments from many levels in the human being, meaning the worker. So I think it's just a different way of seeing things. I think that
mm,
ergonomists, if possible, should work with hygienists, and that's why I brought back this slide. Um, there might be hygienists that are amazing ergonomists as well, but not everyone might be um, might have that sensibility. And maybe, again, when I said that they are not two hygienists the same, they're hygienists, they are amazing in data analysis, but they lack into human interaction with the workers, even though they should have a little
mm,
bit from a caring perspective. But like, it's just a personality thing. And so, even in terms of background, in terms of skills, in terms of interest, the same is true for the skills and the discipline in terms of ergonomy and ergonomist. So I do believe, for example, these um, fields that I have in this slide in the future, I should have almost like bubbles that they intersect and they overlap, because that's what it is ultimately.
yeah, like it seems like the focus in ergonomics on design could be really useful to occupational hygienists and this idea of human-centered design. I feel like I'm seeing that more in ergonomics than occupational hygiene. And I,
Yeah.
I like the idea of yeah, having this diagram sort of in Venn diagrams where there is some overlap and there's not even like squares around a single one. I
Yeah,
think that's a really good view.
yeah,
We're about at the top of the hour. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today, and thank you, Emanuele, for such a thought-provoking presentation. Um, Again, I wrote this in the chat, but feel free to email cohce@berkeley.edu if you'd like the slides. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was awesome to be with you all.
Great. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.